Hi, it's Kim, and today I am talking to you about energy. This topic involves a lot of terminology, and on the surface might seem a little boring. I'll be the first to admit that. But it's very important to understand these concepts as we move toward talking about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, two incredibly important metabolic pathways that take place in living organisms. And to understand those, you need to know some basic concepts about energy. We're going to be, really leading up to talking about cells needing energy, how cells produce energy. And so it's important right from the beginning to understand really why or when does a cell need energy? And there are several reasons when and why. The first one, obviously, that we think about is movement. We're talking about movement of materials within the cell. So if you think about the lecture on cells, materials don't just free float in the cell, they move along microtubules with the help of what are called motor proteins, and that requires energy. So movement of materials inside the cell that's going to require energy, and also movement of entire cells. So if you're a protist and you need to move your entire cell, you're going to require energy to do that. Cell division. Taking an existing cell and dividing it into two new cells is going to require energy. We're going to talk about the details of cell division in a future lecture. Molecular transport. This doesn't always require energy. If you recall our lecture on transport across the cell membrane, there's what's called passive transport that doesn't require energy. And that was going from area of high concentration to area of lower concentration. In molecular transport, though, if you're going against a concentration gradient, remember that requires energy, and that was called active transport. So this is moving molecules or even ions against a concentration gradient. And that is going to require energy. Okay, and then certain chemical reactions require energy to take place. Not all chemical reactions require energy input. They all require a little bit of energy to get started, but some require a lot of energy. And you'll see when we start talking about these chemical reactions that some chemical reactions actually require a lot of energy input, while some chemical reactions actually release energy. And we're going to be talking about that in this lecture today. Important to realize when we talk about energy, there are two major categories of energy. The first of those is what is called potential energy. And potential energy is what we commonly call stored energy. This is an energy source waiting to be used. It's being stored. We have already talked about two major sources of potential energy in this class. So going back to chemical bonds, what type of chemical bonds did we say have a lot of potential energy stored in them? It was covalent bonds. So covalent bonds of molecules are an excellent source of stored energy. Another source of energy that we have already talked about in the transport across cell membranes is we talked about concentration gradients being a source of energy. And I'm just going to quickly remind you about that because this is going to be a very important part of the story in both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So covalent bonds are going to be important and also concentration gradients. So just a reminder of that. If I have a membrane, and I'm just going to draw it horizontally. And let's say that on one side of this membrane, I have a lot of hydrogen ions. And they are charged. And remember, this membrane is mostly a phospholipid bilayer. And what do you recall about charged ions or molecules being able to cross the phospholipid bilayer? That's right. Charged ions and molecules cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer. They have to have a protein to come across, a very specific protein specific to that ion or molecule. So in this case, these hydrogen ions are all outside the membrane. This is a concentration gradient. They can't just come back across. And when they do come across, they're going to come back through a very specific protein, and they're going to generate energy as they come across. Think of water behind a dam. So if we happened to have an enzyme embedded in this membrane that would allow these hydrogens to come back across the membrane, as they come back across, they are going to be a source of energy. They're going to create energy. So two sources of potential energy. This concentration gradient is a good example. And then the energy contained in covalent bonds, especially the covalent bonds of our food molecules. The other category of energy, so the first one was potential energy. The other category is what is called kinetic energy. And really, kinetic energy used to just be called the energy of motion. I don't really like that because not all energy is something moving. So this is really energy being used and there are several sources of this energy. There is motion, light, and heat. When we start talking about cellular respiration and also photosynthesis, you're going to see light energy and heat involved in both of those stories. So potential energy and kinetic energy. I'm going to go back to covalent bonds for a moment because we talked about two different types of covalent bonds when we had this lecture earlier in the semester. And remember, in one type of covalent bonds, the atoms are sharing electrons more equally, whereas in the other category, they're sharing unequally. And this is going to be significant when we start talking about potential energy. So remember, two categories: nonpolar covalent bonds. And remember, this happened when the two atoms had the same or similar electronegativities. They shared more equally. And then we also had polar covalent bonds. And in a polar covalent bond, the two atoms sharing electrons have a relatively large difference in electronegativity, and they do not share electrons equally. So this is unequal sharing of electrons. And remember, water was our big example of that. In the category of nonpolar covalent bonds, we showed several examples, but one of the classic examples of that is when carbon and hydrogen share with each other. And remember, that is the basis for all of those macromolecules. The macromolecules are these chains of carbon and hydrogen, or rings of carbon and hydrogen. So carbon and hydrogen bonded to each other, that's a really good example of a nonpolar covalent bond. When we're talking about potential energy, these nonpolar covalent bonds contain a lot more potential energy than the polar covalent bonds. So nonpolar covalent bonds, more potential energy. That means our food molecules contain a lot more energy than water. And you probably already know that. If you eat glucose, you're going to get a lot more energy out of that than if you drink a glass of water, right? That water is not really going to provide you with energy. It's going to provide you with a lot of other important things. You need water for other reasons. But as far as extracting energy from the bonds of those molecules, you want to do that mostly from a nonpolar covalent bond. And that is all the macromolecules, okay? Primarily the lipids and the carbohydrates. That's where we mostly get our energy. A little bit from protein also. So that's really important to realize. So if you'll recall, when you look at those four categories of macromolecules, really the nucleic acids are not really participating in this story because we don't really use nucleic acids for energy. When we break down a nucleic acid, we're using those nucleotides to build more DNA, RNA, ATP, ADP. We're not using that for an energy source. So 3 of them equal what we call energy sources. And the more non-polar bonds contained in a molecule, the more energy it has. And if you think about which one of those had just pure carbon and hydrogen, a hydrocarbon chain, which one was that had the hydrocarbon chain? Remember, carbohydrates had carbon and hydrogen, but they also had those hydroxyl groups attached. The one that was just carbon and hydrogen, a hydrocarbon chain, those were the lipids, okay, which included the fatty acids. This is why lipids contain more energy per gram than carbohydrates and proteins. And we already gave these numbers when we talked about those molecules, but I'll remind you that carbohydrates and proteins contain 4 kilocalories of energy per gram, while what we call fats, fatty acids, contain 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. And the reason for that is those molecules contain more non-polar covalent bonds. They're a really rich energy source. So I mentioned before that certain chemical reactions require energy, while others are going to actually release energy. And the reason for that is based on how much energy is contained in the reactants versus how much energy is contained in the products. So remember, if we have a chemical reaction, just really I'm just going to do this for our really generalized chemical reaction. Remember, everything on the left side of the arrow, these are the reactants. And on the right side of the arrow, these are the products. And sometimes we have reversible arrows. And in that case, whichever direction the reaction is going, we're always going from reactants to products. We start with reactants, we end with products. How much energy is contained in each of those is very significant. So let's start with the first example. I'm going to draw a diagram here. This is very generalized. So this is going to be energy in kilocalories. And I'm going to show you how much energy is in the reactants. And I'm going to represent that with an R. And then we're going to have P equal the products. So if my reactants have that much energy contained in the bonds, and then my products have this much energy, which one of those has more energy, the reactants or the products? It's very obviously the products, right? So if you start with this much energy in the reactants and you end up with that much energy in the products, do you think you had to put energy in, or do you think energy was released? A good way to think about this is think about your bank balance. Okay, so if you started with this much money in the bank and you ended with this much money in the bank, did you have to put money in, or did you take money out? You had to put money in. And the same thing goes for energy. This required energy input. To get to products that have more energy than reactants, you had to put energy into the system. That energy is now stored in the covalent bonds of that product. So reactants that have less energy than the products, for this reaction to proceed, it requires energy input. From an energy standpoint, a reaction that requires energy input to get to the products is called an endergonic reaction. In an endergonic reaction, the reactants have less energy than the products, and therefore energy input is required. Well, let's look at the opposite of that. Okay, again, we have energy on the side here in kilocalories. And I'll just make this a little taller. And in this case, I have reactants with this much energy. And I have products with only this much energy. So in this case, what has more energy, the reactants or the products? Okay, it's the reactants, right? When you have reactants that have more energy than the products, again, let's think about bank balance. We started with this much money in the bank. We ended with this much money in the bank. Did we put money in or did we take money out? We took money out. Okay, same thing goes for energy. In this case, energy is released. So these products have a lot less energy than we started with. To get to those products, energy was released. And that is called an exergonic reaction. I like to think of energy is exiting the system versus energy is being put into the system. In the cell, there is a process called reaction coupling. And there's one reaction in particular that is coupled to drive chemical reactions in the cell. If you can take an exergonic reaction that is releasing energy and use that to drive an endergonic reaction that requires energy, you can make it happen. Okay, so we can break covalent bonds, or we can use concentration gradients to generate an energy source that can then be used to drive an energy requiring reaction. So exergonic and endergonic reactions can be coupled. They can be put together so that an exergonic reaction that releases energy can be used to drive an endergonic reaction that requires energy. Also associated with this are two other terms that are important to know, and that is catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. So let's first start with this term metabolism. Okay, metabolism is a very misunderstood term in energy. It doesn't mean how fast you break down your food or how fast you burn calories. Metabolism really is the sum of all chemical reactions in an organism. So your metabolism is all of your chemical reactions that are taking place. And as part of your metabolism, we have some pretty significant metabolic pathways. Metabolic pathways are multi-step reactions where the product of one step becomes the reactant of the next step, and enzymes are required. So metabolic reactions that are multi-step are called metabolic pathways. They're sometimes called biochemical pathways as well. They're multi-step, and the product of one step then becomes the reactant of the next step. Okay, so if I had A plus B becoming C, okay, now C is going to become the reactant in the next step, becomes D, which becomes E, which could become our final product. And at each step in this process, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And each step in this process, there's going to be an enzyme required. The reason I'm telling you this, it's very important to realize that sometimes we have just a summary reaction that we write. So for example, for cell respiration and photosynthesis, there's this general equation, but that arrow actually represents multiple steps. And cell respiration and photosynthesis are both metabolic pathways. They take multiple steps to get to that final product, and enzymes are required at each step. And the product of one step then becomes the reactant of the next step. So we have C as our product here, but then now C becomes the reactant to become D. D is the product, but it becomes the reactant to become E, and so on. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are both examples of this. So let's go ahead and write the general equations for both of those reactions, because we're going to be talking about these a lot. So let's start with photosynthesis, the most important chemical reaction on Earth. Photosynthesis, general equation is carbon dioxide and water. I'm going to start with water. So water, carbon dioxide, multiple steps to get to these products. And there's going to be light energy from the sun that's going to come in and drive this. And we're going to end up with a sugar. We don't directly get glucose, as you'll see. and oxygen. Sorry, I'm getting really close to the edge there. That arrow represents multiple steps to get to those products. You don't just get the carbohydrate and the oxygen all in one step. Okay, cellular respiration is really the reverse general equation. This is taking the sugar and oxygen in multiple steps to get to carbon dioxide and water as the products. I'm going to be using these two general equations throughout a lot of the rest of the lecture today as examples of these concepts we're talking about. Okay, let's look at photosynthesis from the standpoint of endergonic versus exergonic. Water and carbon dioxide. Could you eat water and carbon dioxide and get energy out of that? Okay, probably not. And the reason for that is polar covalent bonds. Okay, both of these molecules have polar covalent bonds. Versus we know that glucose is a sugar. We know that when two oxygens share, they must be sharing equally because they're the same atom. So equal sharing of electrons. These are non-polar covalent bonds. Okay, so even if you didn't know that there wasn't energy in water when you drink it, you know that that's a polar covalent bond. And we just said earlier that non-polar covalent bonds contain more energy. So from an energy standpoint, if we look at photosynthesis, and you look at how much energy is in the reactants versus the products, reactants, water and carbon dioxide, low energy. Products, glucose, high energy. So would photosynthesis be endergonic or exergonic? Reactants have less energy than the products. Would that be endergonic or exergonic? Endergonic. Energy input required. In the case of photosynthesis, where does that energy come from? It's the light energy from the sun. Primarily. You're going to see that it's also a concentration gradient that is going to exist when we strip hydrogens away from the water and set up a concentration gradient. We don't really do that, but we're going to see that that happens in photosynthetic organisms. We don't carry out photosynthesis. Okay, so in photosynthesis, less energy in the reactants than the products, energy input required. Let's look at cellular respiration. From an energy standpoint. Okay, in cellular respiration, we start with glucose and oxygen, so non-polar covalent bonds, and we end up with carbon dioxide and water, polar covalent bonds. So we know that non-polar covalent bonds have more energy. We also know that we eat glucose and it has a lot of energy, right? So in that case, we're starting off with reactants that have a lot of energy and ending up with products that have very little energy. So would cell respiration be endergonic or exergonic? It would be exergonic. In other words, energy is released. It's released when we break the covalent bonds of those glucose molecules or the other non-polar covalently bonded macromolecules that enter cellular respiration. Another thing that you can consider here is in photosynthesis, we're really putting a molecule together. So we're breaking the bonds of water and carbon dioxide. And remember, in a chemical reaction, matter is not created or destroyed. All we're doing is we're breaking those bonds and eventually rearranging those molecules rearranging those same atoms. We're rearranging those same exact atoms to build new molecules. So we're taking all of these hydrogens, carbons, and oxygens and rearranging them. And remember, if we count how many are on each side, they're going to be equal. We're just breaking the bonds and rearranging. But there's also an energy component. So we're having to either put energy in or energy is being released to get to those products. What's significant about that is if we're putting something together from a metabolic pathway standpoint, it's what we call anabolic. And if we're breaking something apart, it's what we call catabolic. So in terms of metabolic pathways, we have two possibilities: catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. Okay, anabolic reactions, this is molecules being assembled, and catabolic is molecules breaking apart. Now, first of all, I realize that in all chemical reactions, bonds are being broken and things are being rearranged. But in catabolic, we're going from complex to simple. And in anabolic, we're going from simple parts to complex. They're the opposite of each other. So in anabolic, we're building something, and in catabolic, we're breaking something apart. I like to think of IKEA furniture. Okay, when you assemble IKEA furniture, you're putting furniture together from simpler parts. You're building something more complex. That's called anabolic. If you take anabolic steroids, you're building muscle, you're putting muscle tissue together. Catabolic, catastrophes break things apart. Catabolic reactions break more complex molecules down into simpler parts. So you're going from complex to simple. One of these requires energy input and one releases energy. So if we look at those two from an energy standpoint, breaking bonds is going to release energy. Creating new bonds is going to require energy. So anabolic reactions typically require energy input. So energy input required. And is that endergonic or exergonic when energy input is required? So that's endergonic. So from an energy standpoint, putting things together is endergonic. We call it anabolic from a metabolic pathway standpoint. So if you're putting more complex molecules together from simpler parts, it's called anabolic. And from an energy standpoint, it's endergonic. So those go together. Catabolic, energy is released when you're breaking those bonds. So that is exergonic. So catabolic reactions are exergonic. Going back to our photosynthesis and cell respiration, and now trying to categorize those as either catabolic or anabolic. In cell respiration, we're breaking glucose apart, we're releasing that energy, so it's exergonic. But when you're breaking a more complex molecule down into simpler molecules, that is a catabolic reaction. In photosynthesis, we are making a carbohydrate. Well, we aren't, but photosynthetic organisms are. They are making this more complex sugar from simpler parts. So this is going to be anabolic reaction. And remember, energy input is required to build those more complex molecules versus energy is released when we break those bonds. Okay, so those are really important terms in the energy story. I have a couple of other terms to give you. I keep looking at my paper because I really want to make sure. I know this is a bunch of disjunct terms, but they're all going to come together in the stories of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So they're really important terms to know. Okay, some laws of thermodynamics come into play here. I know you normally think of laws of thermodynamics being in a physics class or a chemistry class, but they are a part of the story we need to tell in energy. And the first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy is never created or destroyed. It just changes form. By the way, that's all one word. I just accidentally had a little space there. So energy is never created or destroyed. It just changes form. So as we carry out a chemical reaction, some of that energy, when we break the covalent bonds, some of that energy is going to get released as heat. That heat is still in the universe and never gets destroyed. It's just changing form. So in that covalent bond, we have this nice, neat package of energy. But as those bonds are broken, a lot of that energy is lost as heat. As we go through cell respiration in particular, you're going to see that not all of the energy contained in the covalent bonds of our food molecules gets directly transferred into the ATP molecule. A lot of that energy is lost as heat. Just as when your engine is breaking down the bonds of the fuel that you put into your car, a lot of that energy is released as heat, and that's why your engine is hot. So energy is never created or destroyed. It's just going to change form. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that as energy is being used, it's going from an orderly state to a disorderly state. Okay, so that covalent bond that we're breaking, that's a nice little orderly package of energy. But when it's released as heat, heat is very disorderly. And you can't now repackage that heat back into a covalent bond. So let's say you take a log and you put it in the fireplace. Okay, that log is a nice, neat little package of energy. All these covalent bonds in the cellulose of that plant material. And now you're going to light it. You're going to combust that log, and you need to have oxygen present. And you're going to start causing that cellulose to break down. And those covalent bonds are going to start releasing energy. That energy is going to get released into the room as heat. Very disorderly form of energy. You can't now take that heat and repackage it back into a log again, right? There's no way to do that. So as energy is used, it changes from an orderly state to a disorderly state. And that disorderly state is called entropy. In other words, we could say that entropy increases, disorder increases as energy is used. So entropy in chemistry and physics is disorder. So the entropy of heat energy is much higher than the energy contained in that covalent bond. Okay, two more big concepts in energy. A lot of terms here. Okay. Redox reactions. Okay, redox is a term that stands for oxidation and reduction. And these two always go together. And I guess someone decided that ox-red didn't sound so great, so they call it redox. Reduction and oxidation. They always go together. You have actually already seen an example of this. Let me just give you the definition of these two terms, and then I'm going to give you some significant examples, one of which you've already seen. So oxidation is loss of electrons. And reduction is gain of electrons. A good way to remember this is, it sounds really silly, but believe me, it helps. Leo, the lion, says grr. Leo, grr. Loss of electrons is oxidation. Gain of electrons is reduction. Leo, grr. It will help you. I know there are some other little mnemonic devices that people use for this, but that's the one that I use. So I'm not going to give you multiple mnemonic devices. I'm just giving you the one that I like. Okay, what does this mean? Well, first, the reason they go together is when electrons are lost, they're not just lost to the universe, they're actually transferred to another molecule or atom. Okay, so as electrons are lost by something, they're gained by something else. And whoever's gaining those electrons isn't just gaining them from the universe, they're gaining them from someone who lost them. So they always go together. You have seen an example of this when we talked about ions. Remember, sodium, atomic number 11. That means it has 11 protons and 11 electrons in its atomic state. But remember, when it comes in contact with chlorine, atomic number 17, so 17 protons and 17 electrons, it tends to lose its electron to chlorine. And the reason for that, if you recall that electron configuration, sodium, atomic number 11, remember the first shell can hold 2, the next shell can hold 8, remember when I told you we never learned anything in this class and just put it in a drawer and never visit it again? Well, here you go. I bet you never thought you'd be drawing electron configuration diagrams again, did you? And here is one right now. So that means sodium just has this one electron out there all by itself. That means sodium has 7 spots it has to fill to become stable. The other thing it can do, though, is it can give that electron away. It can lose it. And who does it tend to lose it to? It tends to lose it to someone who needs it. So chlorine needs that electron to complete its outer shell because it's atomic number 17, which means 2 plus 8 is 10. So that means chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer electron shell, the valence shell. It just needs 1 more to complete its valence shell. So if sodium gives that electron away, chlorine gains 1 electron. Okay, and sodium loses 1 electron. And now they each have a full outer shell, so they're both stable, they become ions, but this is oxidation and reduction. So when that happens, when sodium loses an electron, loss of electron is oxidation. So this is called oxidation. Chlorine gained an electron. Gain of electron is reduction. So we call this reduction. You can also use the verb. Okay, so oxidation and reduction are nouns. You can also use the verb. We can say that sodium is oxidized. That's the verb. Okay, and we can say that chlorine is reduced. How does this relate to cellular respiration and photosynthesis? Well, those are both redox reactions too. And you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of oxidation and reduction going on in those processes. So it's important to realize what's happening. Sometimes loss of electron oxidation, so loss of electrons can also be loss of hydrogen. Remember that hydrogen has 1 electron. Gain of electrons, which is reduction, can also be gain of hydrogen because hydrogen has 1 electron. So let's look at the chemical formula for photosynthesis. Just the general reaction. So remember, water and carbon dioxide, and we typically write glucose as our sugar, but again, you're going to see we don't directly make glucose, or plants and other photosynthetic organisms don't. For carbon dioxide to become glucose and water to become oxygen, oxidation and reduction had to occur. So let's start by looking at carbon dioxide becoming glucose. Okay, CO2. Okay, CO. So we've got carbon and oxygen. We've got carbon and oxygen. For carbon dioxide to become glucose, did it gain hydrogen or did it lose hydrogen? Hydrogen has now appeared and it wasn't there to start with. Okay, so that's a gain of hydrogen. Gain of hydrogen equals gain of electrons. Okay, and that is GER. That is reduction. We could use the verb. We could say that CO2 is reduced to form glucose. Reduction. For water to become oxygen, did it gain hydrogen or lose hydrogen? There's no hydrogen in oxygen, right? So it lost hydrogen. Loss of hydrogen equals loss of electrons. Leo. So that is oxidation. So water becoming oxygen is oxidation. So we say that water is oxidized to form oxygen. Cell respiration is going to be a similar story. Oxidation and reduction are going to happen. You're going to see we have electron carriers that are oxidized and reduced also in both of these stories. So those terms are very important, oxidation and reduction. Loss of electrons and gain of electrons. Sometimes it's loss of hydrogen or gain of hydrogen. One more term. This is it. Phosphorylation. Transfer of a phosphate group. From one molecule to another. And that equals energy transfer. And I'm going to show you how. Okay, reminder of what a phosphate group is. Remember, a phosphate group is a functional group. Oxygen, phosphorus, oxygen, oxygen, oxygen. That's a phosphate group. Do you remember what type of macromolecule has a phosphate group? Just a reminder, it had a pentose sugar, and then it had a phosphate group. And then it had a nitrogenous base over here. And remember, that was a nucleotide. So nucleic acids have phosphate groups. RNA, DNA, ADP, ATP. This story we're telling is energy. Which of these nucleotides, these nucleic acids, has energy associated with it? Both of these. Okay, these were part of the energy story. These are part of the genetics story. So ADP and ATP are going to be what we're talking about. Okay, so ATP and ADP are both nucleotides, but they're pretty crazy because they have more than one phosphate group attached. Remember, a nucleotide is a ribose or deoxyribose sugar, depending on which nucleotide we're talking about. RNA, ATP, and ADP all have a ribose as the sugar, adenine as the base. And then in the case of ATP, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP for short. And ADP is adenosine diphosphate. It has two phosphate groups. Why do we care about this? The reason we care about this is because this is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is the energy currency of the cell. How does ATP drive chemical reactions in the cell? How does ATP cause a chemical reaction to happen? It does it through phosphorylation, transfer of a phosphate group from one molecule to another. If we break this bond of ATP and release this phosphate group, if this phosphate group gets transferred to another molecule, it equals energy. Okay, so energy is released when that happens. This is catabolic and it's exergonic. So breaking that bond and releasing that energy, that's exergonic. It releases energy. That energy then can get coupled, that energy release can get coupled with an endergonic reaction, and through reaction coupling, we can drive that reaction with the energy that's released. So transfer this phosphate group, breaking this bond, this high energy bond, and releasing that phosphate group, that represents a lot of energy transfer. It's exergonic. But now what are we left with? We're left with just two phosphate groups because that one was transferred. Okay, that is phosphorylation, transferring that phosphate group, and it's exergonic. It releases energy. But now we're left with ADP. We need to now stick another phosphate group on there to regenerate ATP. So when we quote, make ATP in cellular respiration, all we're doing is adding a phosphate group to ADP to regenerate ATP. We're rephosphorylating. We're transferring a phosphate group from somewhere else back to ADP to make ATP. So you can see that happening here. you can see this phosphate group is going to get added back to ADP, and we're going to regenerate ATP. That is endergonic. It requires energy input. Where does the energy come from to do that? It comes from two places. It comes from the energy in our food, in the covalent bonds of our food. It's going to come from a concentration gradient that we're going to set up in the cell. And in the case of photosynthesis, it also comes from the sun. So we're going to have multiple energy sources at play when we make ATP. We're going to make ATP, again, I say we, but what I mean is we're going to show the process of making ATP in photosynthetic organisms. We don't do that. And you're going to see that in photosynthesis, these organisms make ATP. That ATP then becomes the energy source for making carbohydrates from water and CO2. So even the energy from the sun has to get converted to ATP for that process to take place. So ATP is going to be the energy source in both cellular respiration and in photosynthesis. And the way we drive that endergonic reaction is by the potential energy in covalent bonds, okay, in the concentration gradient that's going to get set up. I'm just abbreviating it, Const gradient. Okay, and in the case of photosynthesis, we're talking about the sun, the light energy from the sun. These are all going to be a part of the stories of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Important to realize, breaking this bond and releasing a phosphate group, that is exergonic. Adding that phosphate group back on, that's endergonic. That's going to require energy input. And when we say we're making ATP, we're never making it from scratch. Okay, we're not assembling ATP from scratch. What's happening is a third phosphate group is getting added back onto ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make adenosine triphosphate. Okay, I know that was a lot. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. These are all important terms that are going to be used in the next two lectures to explain cellular respiration and photosynthesis, two incredibly important chemical reactions.